Today, we present a research paper by Ashraf Dowla titled Command of Self-Respect, the Last Line of Defense Against Tyranny. Dowla confronts a stark question. When power becomes absolute and no institution can restrain it, what prevents tyranny? His answer is direct and uncompromising. Law can be captured. Religion can be manipulated. Knowledge can be weaponized. External systems fail when those in power control them. The only remaining safeguard is internal command. The core thesis of this paper is simple and powerful. Self-respect, understood as unwavering commitment to one's own moral dignity, is the final barrier against abuse of power. When it is present, authority restrains itself. When it is absent, nothing else is enough. Let us begin. Title: Command of Self-Respect, the Last Line of Defense Against Tyranny. Introduction: The Problem of Absolute Power. Consider, in the year 2048, a technologically advanced, militarily superior, abundance of state property state, Kunduland, received an Iron Man ruler in their country. The Haska did not seize authority through violence, but in a political process. He assumed leadership within a system that was already centralized, digitally integrated, and administratively efficient. The king desired to become supreme and wanted no rivalry around him. He wanted to stay on the crown forever and to face all other political process. As such, he applied his cleverness, and over time, legislative councils became advisory bodies. Courts maintained procedural form, but gradually lost substantive independence. Elections continued, yet their outcomes no longer carried uncertainty. To avoid any uprising, Haska used another trick. He built a very simplistic, fake public image of very simple living style, no luxury, no private property in name, but friendly and loving words for all. Along with Haska, his close associates also followed the same. However, Haska maintained his core desire to stay on power for lifelong. Haska controlled the military. He controlled fiscal resources. He controlled digital communication infrastructures. He shaped the narratives through which citizens interpreted political reality. No external rival remained capable of meaningful resistance. Institutional checks did not disappear through open abolition. They weakened through gradual absorption into centralized authority. The state appeared stable and orderly. However, beneath that stability lay a fundamental asymmetry. Power no longer had an effective counterweight. In such a condition, the central question shifts. It is no longer what a ruler can do, but what will restrain him from doing harm. If property can be confiscated without judicial reversal, dissent suppressed without consequence, and law reinterpreted without opposition, what protects citizens from the will of the powerful? Political theory has traditionally answered this problem through institutional design. Constitutionalism, separation of powers, rule of law, and democratic accountability are regarded as principal safeguards against tyranny. These mechanisms share a common assumption. Power must be limited from the outside. Fear of sanction, reputational cost, and institutional counterforce are expected to deter abuse. History, however, reveals recurring limitations. Institutions can be captured. Legal systems can be manipulated. Faith can be instrumentalized. Knowledge can be weaponized. Religious commitment has not consistently prevented atrocity. Education has not guaranteed moral restraint. Technical sophistication has often increased destructive capacity. When those who wield authority also control the instruments designed to regulate them, external safeguards lose force. Thus, the central problem statement of this article therefore emerges as when power has no effective external rival, what restrains it? This paper advances a normative and conceptual thesis. The thesis demands that the power of self-respect functions as the core drive to control humans as the final inner command. Self-respect, understood as internal moral sovereignty, functions as the final safeguard against the abuse of concentrated power. However, self-respect is not reputation, self-esteem, or public honor. It is the internal recognition of one's own moral dignity combined with a commitment to act in accordance with that dignity. It operates as an inner constitution. It binds conduct to identity even when formal constitutions fail. Where self-respect is present, power encounters self-imposed limits. Where it is absent, power expands until checked by force or collapse. This article contributes to political and moral theory in 3 ways. First, it reframes self-respect as a foundational virtue that stabilizes other moral commitments, such as compassion, integrity, and responsibility. Second, it integrates political theory with moral psychology by proposing a model of internal sovereignty grounded in identity-based self-regulation. Third, it offers a normative framework for understanding restraint in contexts of institutional fragility and technological concentration of authority. The argument proceeds in several stages. The next section clarifies the methodological orientation of the study. The following section situates the argument within existing scholarship on power, virtue, and moral identity. Subsequent sections examine the limits of external safeguards, develop the concept of self-respect as internal moral sovereignty, and explain the psychological mechanisms through which it regulates behavior. Historical illustrations are then presented to illuminate the argument. The later sections advance the claim that self-respect functions as a foundational virtue and consider its implications for contemporary systems marked by technological asymmetry. The final section synthesizes the analysis. Methodological orientation. This article develops a normative and theoretical argument concerning the relationship between concentrated power and internal moral restraint. It does not attempt to measure self-respect empirically, nor does it claim deterministic proof that self-respect prevents tyranny. Instead, it offers a conceptual and structural account of how internal moral sovereignty functions as a safeguard when external constraints weaken or collapse. The methodological approach rests on 3 components. First, the study employs conceptual analysis. The concept of self-respect is clarified and distinguished from related ideas such as self-esteem, honor, reputation, and religious fear. This clarification is necessary because much of the existing literature treats self-respect either as a psychological trait or as a social good. It is rarely examined as a structural regulator of power. By refining the concept, the article establishes its relevance for political theory. Second, the analysis draws from normative political theory and virtue ethics. These traditions emphasize character and internal moral formation as foundations of political order. Rather than concentrating solely on institutional design, the present framework examines the moral structure of those who exercise authority. It asks how identity and dignity shape conduct when institutional oversight is limited. Third, the argument incorporates findings from moral psychology, research on moral identity, internalized values, anticipatory self-sanction, and moral injury provides insight into how identity-based commitments regulate behavior. These perspectives explain how restraint may operate independently of surveillance or external enforcement. Their inclusion strengthens the plausibility of the proposed model. Historical examples presented in later sections function as illustrations rather than empirical tests. They illuminate patterns consistent with the conceptual framework, but do not claim causal verification. The central claim of the article is structural rather than predictive. When external systems of restraint lose effectiveness, the stability of moral order depends on internalized moral identity. Self-respect, understood as internal moral sovereignty, provides the architecture through which such identity-based restraint operates. By clarifying both the normative foundation and the psychological mechanisms of this claim, the article contributes to discussions on political authority, leadership ethics, and the sustainability of order under conditions of asymmetrical power. Literature, context, power, virtue, and internal restraint. The question of how to restrain power has shaped political thought for centuries. From classical constitutionalism to modern democratic theory, scholars have sought mechanisms to prevent authority from degenerating into tyranny. Most traditions emphasize structural safeguards. Law, institutional design, and distributed authority are presented as primary defenses against abuse. At the same time, philosophical and psychological traditions suggest that moral restraint depends not only on structure, but also on character. This section situates the present argument within four related strands of scholarship: constitutional theory, virtue ethics, philosophical accounts of self-respect, and moral psychology. Institutional safeguards in political theory. Classical political theory treats tyranny as a structural problem. Montesquieu argued that liberty requires separation of powers to prevent concentration of authority. Madison similarly maintained that ambition must counteract ambition through institutional design. Modern constitutionalism continues this tradition. Rule of law, checks and balances, and democratic accountability are regarded as vital safeguards. These approaches rest on a shared premise. Power must be limited from the outside. Institutions function as counterweights. Legal procedures impose constraints. Public scrutiny deters misconduct. However, scholars have recognized limits to this model. Institutional safeguards depend on independence and enforceability. When authority captures enforcement mechanisms, law may lose its restraining function. Arendt showed that bureaucratic systems can operate efficiently while enabling injustice when moral judgment is suspended. Institutions do not guarantee moral governance if those who operate them lack internal restraint. This insight reveals a structural vulnerability. External safeguards depend on the character of those entrusted with power. Virtue ethics and character formation. Virtue ethics offers a different emphasis. Aristotle argued that stable ethical conduct arises from habituated character rather than external compulsion. For him, law supports virtue but does not replace it. A just ruler must possess internal moral formation. MacIntyre later emphasized that virtues are cultivated within traditions and practices. Moral stability depends on identity, shaped by shared norms. Virtues endure because they are integrated into the self rather than imposed by surveillance. Yet, virtue theory rarely addresses concentrated authority directly. It speaks of character in general terms, but does not fully explore how character functions when external limits weaken. The present argument extends this tradition by proposing that self-respect operates as a stabilizing structure under asymmetrical power. Self-respect in moral philosophy. Philosophical discussions of dignity provide important foundations. Kant grounded moral agency in respect for oneself as a rational being. To violate moral law is to diminish one's own dignity. Moral obligation, therefore, involves internal accountability. Rawls identified self-respect as central to a just society. He argued that it enables individuals to pursue meaningful life plans. Although Rawls emphasized institutional support for self-respect, his analysis underscores its importance for moral agency. Darwall distinguished between recognition respect and appraisal respect. His work highlights the normative authority individuals possess as moral agents. These traditions establish self-respect as integral to dignity and autonomy. However, they do not explicitly examine its function as a safeguard against concentrated political power. The present study builds on these insights by conceptualizing self-respect as internal moral sovereignty, moral psychology, and identity. Based regulation developments in moral psychology strengthen this perspective. Research on moral identity suggests that individuals regulate behavior to preserve coherence between values and self-concept. When integrity becomes central to identity, misconduct threatens psychological stability. Self-determination? Theory emphasizes that behavior aligned with internalized values is more stable than behavior driven by external pressure. Internalization transforms moral norms into self-directed commitments. Studies on moral injury show that violations of deeply held values produce lasting psychological distress. Anticipation of such internal consequences may deter wrongdoing, even in the absence of punishment. Narrative identity research further suggests that individuals strive for coherence across time. Actions inconsistent with self-narrative create instability. These strands of scholarship indicate that internal moral structures may regulate conduct independently of institutional enforcement. The theoretical gap. Despite these insights, an important question remains insufficiently answered. How does self-respect function as a structural safeguard when institutional counterweights fail? Institutional theories assume enforceable limits. Virtue theories focus on character without addressing asymmetrical authority. Psychological models examine individual behavior outside concentrated political power. This article addresses that gap. It integrates political theory and moral psychology into a unified account. Self-respect is presented as internal moral sovereignty, capable of regulating power when external systems are weakened. The structural limits of external controls. The dominant tradition in political thought presumes that power is best restrained through institutional architecture. Constitutional design distributes authority. Legal systems define boundaries. Democratic accountability creates oversight. These mechanisms are essential for political stability. However, their effectiveness depends on enforceability and independence. When authority gains influence over enforcement mechanisms, legal systems may lose their restraining capacity. Law can then become an instrument of authorization rather than limitation. Arendt demonstrated that bureaucratic and legal structures can function formally while facilitating injustice when moral judgment is suspended. Religion also provides moral guidance. It strengthens cohesion and transmits shared values. Yet religion does not automatically ensure restraint. Durkheim observed that religious identity reinforces social solidarity. It may also intensify boundaries between groups. Without internalized dignity, religious commitment can coexist with coercion or exclusion. Education enhances competence and analytical capacity. It expands strategic thinking and technical skill. Yet knowledge does not determine moral orientation. Bauman argued that modern rational systems can enable large-scale harm when technical efficiency operates without ethical grounding. Knowledge increases capacity. It does not guarantee integrity. These observations reveal a structural limitation. Law, religion, and education are necessary components of social order. They are not sufficient when enforceable limits weaken. If those who hold authority also control the institutions designed to regulate them, external safeguards lose force. Under conditions of concentrated power, regulation must arise from within the individual. When external counterweights diminish, internal boundaries become decisive. This structural insight prepares the transition to the central concept of the study. If external controls are vulnerable, then moral restraint must depend on a deeper internal foundation. Self-respect as internal moral sovereignty. If external safeguards are structurally limited, the question becomes whether a stable internal safeguard is possible. This section develops the central claim of the article. Self-respect functions as internal moral sovereignty. It regulates power even when external enforcement weakens. Self-respect refers to the internal recognition of one's own moral dignity, combined with a commitment to act consistently with that dignity. It is not equivalent to self-esteem. Self-esteem fluctuates with approval and achievement. Self-respect remains stable because it is grounded in identity. Philosophical traditions support this understanding. Kant argued that moral agency depends on respect for oneself as a rational being. To violate moral law is to diminish one's own dignity. Rawls emphasized that self-respect is essential for pursuing any meaningful conception of the good. These perspectives suggest that moral restraint arises from internal accountability rather than external fear. Self-respect differs from reputation or honor. Reputation depends on how others judge conduct. Honor often depends on social recognition. Self-respect operates internally. It asks whether one can remain coherent with one's own moral standard. When moral commitments are integrated into identity, behavior becomes self-regulated. Research in moral psychology shows that individuals act consistently when moral values are central to the self. Misconduct then threatens identity coherence. The anticipated loss is not only social standing, but self-integrity. Self-respect therefore functions as a stabilizing structure. It binds virtue to identity. Justice, responsibility, and compassion endure because abandoning them would mean self-betrayal. In this sense, self-respect operates as a foundational virtue. It sustains other moral commitments across circumstances. When self-respect is absent, identity may depend on domination or external validation. Authority may become a means of affirming worth. In such cases, power expands rather than restrains itself. Without internal sovereignty, external sovereignty faces no internal boundary. Under concentrated authority, this distinction becomes decisive. Where self-respect is present, power encounters self-imposed limits. Where it is absent, power expands until constrained by force, resistance, or collapse. Psychological mechanisms of internal restraint. If self-respect functions as internal moral sovereignty, it must operate through identifiable psychological processes. Moral restraint cannot remain a purely philosophical claim. It must be explained in terms of how individuals regulate their own conduct. Identity-based self-regulation operates through several interconnected mechanisms. First, moral identity integration aligns action with self-concept. When integrity, fairness, or responsibility become central to how a person understands himself, misconduct threatens identity coherence. The individual does not merely consider external consequences, he anticipates the loss of internal consistency. This anticipation generates resistance before action occurs. Second, anticipatory moral emotion functions as internal sanction. Research on moral injury shows that violating deeply held values produces lasting psychological distress. Feelings of shame, guilt, and fragmentation often follow moral transgression. Even when wrongdoing remains undiscovered, the internal cost may persist. The expectation of such internal disruption can deter misconduct in advance. Third, autonomy grounded in internalized values strengthens self-regulation. When moral principles are deeply integrated, behavior does not depend on surveillance or fear of punishment. Individuals govern themselves through principle rather than compulsion. This form of autonomy represents freedom from impulse rather than freedom from responsibility. Fourth, narrative coherence influences decision-making across time. Individuals construct a sense of identity through life narratives. They seek continuity between past actions and future aspirations. Conduct that contradicts this narrative creates instability. To preserve coherence, individuals avoid actions that fracture their moral self-understanding. Together, These mechanisms explain how self-respect may regulate behavior even when external deterrence is absent. Power amplifies opportunity and capacity. Internal moral sovereignty introduces restraint before harm occurs. When these mechanisms are weak or absent, regulation depends entirely on external constraint. If external limits diminish, misconduct becomes more likely. The stability of moral order then depends on force or resistance rather than self-limitation. This analysis reinforces the central thesis. That is, self-respect is not merely a personal virtue. It is a structural condition for moral restraint under concentrated authority. Historical illustrations of internal and external sovereignty. When external safeguards weaken, internal moral sovereignty becomes decisive. Historical cases cannot prove this claim in a deterministic way. However, they can illuminate patterns consistent with it. The following illustrations contrast contexts in which power was exercised with restraint and contexts in which it expanded destructively. Restraint under asymmetrical power. In 1187, after military victory in Jerusalem, Saladin possessed overwhelming authority. There was no immediate rival capable of retaliation. The structural conditions permitted retribution on a large scale. Yet, historical accounts indicate that large-scale massacre did not follow his entry into the city. Civilians were permitted ransom. Vulnerable populations received assistance. Negotiated departure was allowed. This episode does not suggest moral perfection, nor does it remove the broader violence of the era. It does, however, illustrate a structural feature. Where asymmetry of power existed, restraint remained possible. Authority did not automatically translate into maximal domination. Internal commitments appear to have shaped conduct at a moment when external constraint was limited. Discipline under institutional strain. During the evacuation at Dunkirk in May 1940, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers found themselves pressed against the shoreline of northern France. Behind them advanced a rapidly moving German force. Before them stretched the cold waters of the English Channel. Air raids thundered overhead. Artillery echoed across the sand. Smoke and confusion blurred the horizon. The soldiers had retreated under relentless pressure. Many units were fragmented. Command structures were strained. Communication was inconsistent. Supplies were limited. Exhaustion and uncertainty weighed heavily on men who only days earlier had expected organized defense rather than desperate withdrawal. In such conditions, institutional enforcement capacity weakens. Orders become harder to transmit and harder to verify. Surveillance of discipline becomes nearly impossible. Fear spreads quickly through crowded ranks. Rumors travel faster than instruction. Survival instinct can overtake collective coordination. A breakdown of discipline was entirely possible. Panic could have produced chaos. Crowds might have rushed boats in desperation. Units could have dissolved into scattered attempts at individual escape. Yet, historical accounts describe a different pattern. Long lines formed along the beaches. Soldiers waited for evacuation in organized ranks. Officers and enlisted personnel alike assisted the wounded. Despite bombardment and uncertainty, large-scale disorder did not dominate the evacuation. This episode does not suggest the absence of fear. Fear was pervasive. Rather, it illustrates how internalized professional identity and collective self-respect can stabilize conduct when external enforcement mechanisms are strained. Discipline persisted not solely because authority commanded it, but because many soldiers understood themselves as representatives of something larger than immediate impulse. This example illustrates how internalized norms can stabilize behavior when institutional enforcement weakens. Expansion without internal limit. A contrasting pattern can be observed in Germany during the late 1930s under Adolf Hitler. By that period, authority had become increasingly centralized. Political opposition had been neutralized through intimidation, imprisonment, and legal prohibition. Independent parties were dissolved. Trade unions were absorbed into state-controlled structures. Public dissent became dangerous. Legal institutions remained in form, yet their substance shifted. Courts continued to operate, but judicial independence weakened as interpretation aligned with ideological directives. Legislative authority lost autonomy as executive power expanded. Law did not disappear. Instead, it was reshaped to authorize policies that would previously have been unthinkable. The transformation did not occur in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded through gradual consolidation. Emergency powers were normalized. Administrative decrees expanded. Bureaucratic efficiency was preserved, even strengthened. Institutional language remained intact while moral content shifted. In this environment, external counterweights were progressively dismantled. No independent political force remained capable of imposing restraint. The press was subordinated. Civil society organizations were either absorbed or silenced. Enforcement mechanisms operated in service of centralized authority. At that stage, internal restraint became decisive. The question was no longer whether institutions could prevent expansion. It was whether the leadership would impose limits upon itself. However, ideological identity had redefined moral boundaries. Universal human dignity was no longer the operative standard. Moral consideration became selective. Certain groups were systematically excluded from full recognition. Once exclusion was normalized, coercive policies could be framed not as violations, but as fulfillment of ideological purpose. The internal standard that might have limited conduct did not function as a boundary. Instead, it was restructured to legitimize domination. Legal language, administrative order, and strategic planning combined with ideological conviction. Authority expanded through coordinated policy rather than spontaneous impulse. The result was systematic escalation. Coercive measures intensified. Discrimination hardened into persecution. Persecution evolved into organized violence. External safeguards had already weakened. Internal moral sovereignty did not impose restraint. Expansion continued until countered by overwhelming external force. This pattern illustrates the structural risk identified in this article. When institutional counterweights collapse and internal limits are redefined rather than strengthened, authority may expand without boundary. The decisive variable is not administrative efficiency or intelligence, but the presence or absence of internal moral sovereignty. Structural pattern. Across these illustrations, a pattern emerges. When identity integrates moral dignity as a stable commitment, power may remain self-limiting even under asymmetry. When dignity is absent or restricted to selective groups, power tends toward expansion once external checks weaken. These cases do not eliminate the importance of institutions. They reinforce the argument that institutions depend on the internal commitments of those who operate them. When external counterweights diminish, the architecture of the self becomes decisive. Self-respect as foundational virtue. The preceding analysis has shown that self-respect can function as internal moral sovereignty when external safeguards weaken. The argument now moves further. Self-respect is not merely one virtue among others. It operates as a foundational condition for moral stability. Virtues such as justice, courage, compassion, and responsibility regulate specific domains of conduct. Justice governs fairness. Courage moderates fear. Compassion guides care for others. Responsibility shapes accountability. These virtues are essential for ethical life. However, virtues may become unstable when detached from identity. Justice may yield to convenience. Courage may turn into aggression. Compassion may weaken under pressure. Responsibility may be avoided when costly. In such cases, virtues remain conditional. Self-respect provides structural stability. It binds virtue to identity. When an individual understands himself as a bearer of moral dignity, abandoning virtue becomes self-betrayal rather than strategic adjustment. The cost is internal fragmentation rather than external criticism. Philosophical traditions support this view. Kant argued that moral law is binding because rational agents legislate it for themselves. To act unjustly is to undermine one's own dignity. Moral obligation therefore arises from self-recognition rather than external command. This perspective suggests that self-respect functions as a condition of moral agency. Without recognition of one's own dignity, norms lose internal authority. They appear imposed rather than chosen. When external pressure weakens, compliance declines. The relationship between self-respect and peace also becomes clearer. Durable peace depends on restraint. It requires individuals and institutions to limit the use of available force. Surveillance alone cannot ensure restraint. At some point, limitation must arise from internal commitment. Where self-respect is present, power is moderated by self-imposed boundaries. Where it is absent, restraint depends entirely on external counterforce. In such cases, peace remains fragile. The absence of self-respect may also produce compensatory dynamics. When identity lacks internal dignity, authority may become a source of validation. Domination may substitute for coherence. Power expands not from strength, but from internal deficit. Self-respect therefore operates as inner constitution. Written constitutions structure political systems, yet they are interpreted and enforced by individuals. When those individuals lack internal moral limits, formal safeguards weaken. Internal sovereignty becomes the final boundary. Under conditions of concentrated authority, this foundational role becomes decisive. Self-respect sustains moral order when external systems falter. Implications for contemporary and future political systems. The argument developed in this article gains particular relevance in the present era. Concentrated authority today does not always resemble classical monarchy or overt dictatorship. Power increasingly operates through technological integration, economic centralization, and administrative coordination. Influence may be exercised through digital infrastructures, algorithmic systems, financial control, or information management, rather than visible coercion. In such contexts, institutional safeguards may remain formally intact. Courts may function, elections may occur, media outlets may operate, yet structural asymmetry can still emerge. Authority may become insulated through systemic integration rather than explicit abolition of opposition. When oversight mechanisms become dependent on the same networks they seek to regulate, enforceable counterweights may weaken. External checks may become slower, fragmented, or symbolic. Under these conditions, internal restraint acquires heightened importance. The cultivation of self-respect therefore becomes a matter of institutional concern. Leadership development often emphasizes technical competence, strategic planning, and performance metrics. These skills are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Without internal moral sovereignty, competence can magnify harm rather than reduce it. Educational systems frequently transmit information and professional skills. Less attention is devoted to identity formation, grounded in dignity and responsibility. Yet, identity-based restraint is precisely what becomes decisive when authority is asymmetrical. Institutions cannot rely solely on surveillance or compliance mechanisms. They must foster cultures that reinforce internal accountability. Transparency, fairness, and consistent ethical standards contribute to the development of self-respect. When leaders model dignity and responsibility, internal sovereignty becomes more likely to stabilize conduct. This perspective does not diminish the importance of constitutional design. External safeguards remain essential. However, institutional durability depends on the character of those who interpret and implement rules. Where self-respect declines among decision-makers, institutional forms may persist while moral substance erodes. In an era marked by rapid technological change and expanding asymmetries of influence, internal moral sovereignty becomes a form of moral capital. It functions as reserve restraint when regulatory systems lag behind innovation. The stability of humane political order therefore depends not only on the distribution of power, but also on the integration of dignity into identity among those who wield it. Conclusion. This article began with a simple but demanding question. When power has no effective external rival, what restrains it? Political theory has traditionally relied on institutional design to answer this problem. Separation of powers, rule of law, and democratic accountability are essential safeguards. They remain indispensable for stable governance, yet their effectiveness depends on independence and enforceability. When authority captures the mechanisms designed to regulate it, external safeguards lose force. Historical experience confirms that institutions can be manipulated. Legal systems can legitimize injustice. Religion can be instrumentalized. Knowledge can amplify destructive capacity. External systems are necessary, but they are not self-sustaining. The argument advanced in this study is structural rather than rhetorical. When external counterweights weaken, internal moral sovereignty becomes decisive. Self-respect, understood as recognition of one's own moral dignity, combined with commitment to act consistently with that dignity, functions as an inner constitution. It binds conduct to identity. It generates restraint before harm occurs. Philosophically, self-respect supports moral agency by grounding obligation in self-recognition. Psychologically, it operates through identity integration, anticipatory self-sanction, autonomy, and narrative coherence. Historically, patterns suggest that where internal dignity stabilizes authority, restraint remains possible under asymmetry. Where it is absent, power expands until checked by force or collapse. Self-respect therefore operates as a foundational virtue. It stabilizes justice, responsibility, and compassion across changing circumstances. Without it, virtues remain conditional. With it, moral commitments become integral to identity. In an era of technological concentration and systemic asymmetry, the relevance of internal moral sovereignty intensifies. External oversight may weaken or lag behind concentrated authority. Under such conditions, the durability of humane order depends not only on institutional architecture but on the moral formation of those who wield power. The ultimate safeguard of political order is not written solely in constitutional texts. It is sustained within the conscience of the powerful. When power has no rival, the final boundary is the self.